If you're a fan of the channel, you know this is my everyday carry. This is the Sony A7C2 with a Tamron 24mm f2.8. However, when I was going to Europe last summer, I definitely wanted to take my Sony A7C2, but I wanted to fit it in my favorite travel bag, which is this bag, the PacSafe Vibe 100 hip pack. Now, I have an excellent review of this bag on my channel. I'll post a card here and then a link in the description. But as you can probably figure out already by seeing this, the Tamron was just a little too big to fit comfortably within this hip pack. And so I decided to buy a smaller lens, and what I settled on was a Sony 28mm f2.0, even though at this point it is a 10-year-old lens. And here's what it looks like on the camera. Now, I did do a quick review of this lens before I left. I'll put a card to the full review here, and the review does include sample pictures. Plus, I'll put a link in the description. But here's a summary of what I said in that video. Okay, so let's talk about the pros and cons of the Sony 28mm f2.0. The first pro is that it's compact and lightweight. It also has a fast aperture at 2.0. I also was surprised by how fast the focusing is on this camera. It did miss focus a couple of times, but overall it's very fast to focus and it's silent. Finally, being a 10-year-old lens, it's very affordable on the used market. I paid $226 for my copy, and that includes tax and shipping to Hawaii. On to the cons. The first con is that the colors are very dull. There's no other way to put it. I usually add just a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation to my photos, but even adding that usual amount of saturation and vibrance, it just couldn't bring out any colors in these pictures. Also, I think the lens's age is showing. The details are okay, but it's nowhere sharp as the Tamron 24mm. Finally, this could be a con just depending on your perspective, but there is no focus control button on there, and there's no aperture ring either. And so, you know, a lot of the newer cameras have that, even at pretty reasonable price points. So if you're looking for those kinds of features, they're definitely lacking in this lens. So how did it do on my trip? Stay tuned to find out. Let's talk about this first picture. This picture was taken late afternoon. The camera settings were f2, ISO 100, and a shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second. This is one of those situations where if I had time to think about it, I probably should have dialed in an f2.8 or f4 because I'm bumping up against the mechanical shutter limit. Regardless, I think the exposure is perfect. You can see the dazzling white marble that's being hit directly with the sun, and yet you can also see the shadows starting to creep in on the right. I think the color of the sky and the Italian flags are vivid and lifelike, and I like how it captured the gold tones in the statues and behind the central figure. When I got this lens, I was wondering if I would miss that extra 4mm of width, and I can say for my style of travel photography, the wider the better. You can see that in this particular shot, I wasn't able to get the entire monument in frame, so I think that extra 4mm would have helped in that regard. And that will be a common theme across these pictures, that a little bit of extra width would have helped. This second picture of the monument is obviously taken at a much later time in the afternoon. However, it does give you a good idea of how far back I had to stand to get the entire monument in frame. In my quick review, I said that this lens was not good at capturing detail, but I officially take that back after seeing the details of the figures carved into the marble. I'm including this picture here for two reasons. First, you can see that the sky is not rendered very well at all. And that's another issue I noticed with this lens, is that it does not handle glare very well. Also, in my earlier review, I said that the lens was very fast focusing. Here's an example of that. I noticed these birds hopping around, and I took a picture of this one. There was no AI assist on it, and it captured the bird perfectly. If we zoom in, you can see the detail in the feathers and the feet. I wanted to include some interior examples. Here I like how the camera was able to capture the difference in the marble sculpture versus the marble wall. In my earlier review, I said that this lens sometimes missed focus. This may be an example of that because I can't tell where the focus point is. However, I do love the colors in this photo, from the brown of the sculpture to the yellow in the background. And then if you look at the archway in the back, you can see that salmon color contrasted against the blue triangle up. This is the main altar in St. Peter's Basilica. This was covered entirely by scaffolding when I was here in 2024, so it was nice to see. If you look at that top row of spotlights, there's some very pleasing starbursts, and that's really surprising because the camera is set at F2.0. Usually you have to stop down the lens a bit to get those kind of starbursts. Now at the top of the frame you can also see some of that flaring, and in fact you can actually see some green and purple. And speaking of lighting, this is one of my absolute favorite shots I took on this trip. Our tour guide was talking to our group and he looked at me and said, "Hey, if you want to take a good picture, turn around." And I was absolutely delighted to capture this picture of God rays coming down through the skylight and onto the altar. This is also one of my favorite pictures from the trip. I'm looking up through the corner of the altar to the dome, and the color and detail in this picture is absolutely amazing. Once again, I take back what I said about this lens not being able to capture detail. I wanted to give a few low-light examples from St. Peter's. Here's a picture from the grottos underneath the basilica. There is some mixed lighting in this alcove, but I think the colors reproduce wonderfully. This is a photo of Michelangelo's La Pieta. This was also entirely covered when we were here in 2024, so I was very excited to see it. However, with the Jubilee renovations, it's actually encased in glass, and you have to view it from pretty far away. Now this picture, I did have to boost the exposure quite a bit to bring out the details. And you can see obviously there is a reflection on the glass there. So it's not the best pick, but given the circumstances, I think it's more than acceptable. Trevi Fountain was absolutely crazy this year, in part because they introduced queuing, so they would only allow a few people up to the front at a time. I tried for 2 quick grab shots as we walked by, and as you can see, if I would have had maybe those extra 4mm of width, I would have been able to capture the fountains. I'm going to insert a picture here from 2024. This picture was taken with my Sony ZV-1, and that has a 24mm full frame equivalent at its widest. Earlier I said that I did not have a picture of the Pantheon, but I did manage to find one, and as you can see, once again, the photo is clipped at the top, and you can see how far back I'm standing from the structure. So once again, I can't help but thinking if that extra 4mm would have helped. This is the altar at Iglesia de San Ignacio. I think the colors in this picture are just absolutely amazing. The camera, the lens, nailed the exposure. I couldn't be happier with how this picture turned out. Now, I neither waited in line nor paid the €2 to use the mirror to be able to take this picture, so it is a little lopsided. I pointed the Sony A7C2 straight up and just tried to take as squared up a picture as I could, and obviously I didn't do that well. However, you still get that 3D effect that the artist was going for. Here the colors aren't as vibrant as the colors facing the altar, but I do think they are accurate. It's now dusk at Piazza Navona. You can see the lights have turned on the billboards, in the square, and then here in the fountain. Here's a detail shot from the fountain. Looks pretty scary to me. Because I bought this mainly to take landscape photos, it's easy to forget that the 28mm f2.0 is also good at taking environmental portraiture, as shown in this family picture here. This was shot at f2 ISO 200 with 1/60th of a shutter speed. At f2.0, I really like the subject background separation. In this particular photo though, there's a little bit too much of a red tinge to it. I think it has something to do with the fact that it's dusk and there's a red sign in the background, and my sister is wearing that fuchsia shirt. So that's something I should have caught when I processed the raw, because that's something that could be fixed rather easily. This is a shot looking back towards the piazza. You can see in the foreground that it's really starting to get dark now. And finally, sunset overlooking the Tiber River. Let's revisit our original list of pros and cons. Obviously, the physical attributes of being compact and lightweight don't change, as well as the fast aperture. Originally, when I purchased the lens, I was thinking more in terms of low light performance with regards to the fast aperture, but now after doing some portraiture with it, I can appreciate the subject and background separation. The lens is fast focusing and silent, although as I mentioned in my early review, it does seem to miss focus occasionally. For me, as someone who takes pictures of things, mostly buildings, artwork, sculpture, etc., that's probably not critical for my style of shooting, but it may be important to someone else who has more of a run and gun style of travel photography. Finally, I did just check the used market, and it is still affordable on the used market, and I definitely would not buy this lens new. There's better lenses that are available at a cheaper price point. On to the cons. I'm adding 2 new cons to the original cons list. The first is that I really do need that extra 4mm of width, so maybe for my style of shooting, 24mm might be more ideal. Also, the lens does have some issues with ghosting and flaring. When I was outdoors, I did shoot with the lens hood, but it still doesn't seem to mitigate that issue 100%. So if you're doing some photography in bright sunlight, you might just need to double check your frame and just make sure that the shot wasn't ruined by any excessive ghosting or flaring. Now I'm going to take 2 items off the cons list. In my earlier review, I said that the lens produced dull colors and that the detail was just okay. But what I've discovered processing the raw files is that you can get some beautiful, vivid colors and that the details that you can bring out are more than acceptable. As I found this to be true of the files coming from my Sony ZV-1 as well. That's a 20 megapixel 1-inch sensor, and I found if you shoot in RAW, you can get some amazing pictures out of that camera. In my earlier review, I was kind of 50-50 as to whether or not a lack of controls was a con. I'm still 50-50 on that point. On my A7C2, I have the front command dial set to adjust aperture, so it's easy enough to do it. However, I do see the advantage of having a dedicated aperture ring. For one thing, I think it's quicker and more tactile, and what I like is that you know exactly what your aperture is set at. You don't have to thumb the wheel and look through the EVF or the back screen to double check the value. However, this obviously adds to the cost and complexity of the lens and possibly the weight, so I'm still 50-50 on whether that is a pro or a con. Now let's talk about some alternatives to the 28mm f2.0. I still think the Tamron 24mm f2.8 is a viable travel option as long as space isn't at a premium. That 67mm lens barrel just makes it a little bit bulky for a 24mm lens. I have a review of this lens on my channel. I'm going to put a card to it here and then post a link in the description. Now this Rokinon lens was the original lens that I wanted to take with me on my trip, but when I was looking to buy, the tariff talks had just begun or had just been implemented and all the used copies dried up. This lens is much smaller than my Tamron lens, however I'm not sure how it compares to the Sony lens, but I would still have the full 24mm of width and it's just as fast at f1.8. I think this lens would be an ideal travel lens because you have the very wide 20mm at one end all the way to 40mm on the long end. So in this one relatively compact zoom lens, you would have all of the popular prime lens focal lengths covered. You would have a 20mm, 24, 28, 35, and 40mm focal length all covered, all at a constant f2.8 aperture. And then if you needed a little more reach, you could put your camera into crop mode, and that would be a 60mm equivalent focal length. This lens was definitely on my wish list, however, it was not in my budget. And speaking of being beyond your budget, that brings us to our last lens. Like the Tamron zoom, this lens starts out at a very wide 20mm, but reaches all the way to 70 on the long end. And then once again, if you needed some additional reach, you could put your camera into crop mode, and then you would have a 105mm focal length equivalent. So this one lens would be good for wide angle through moderate telephoto shooting. This lens also has a focus control button and the aperture ring that we talked about earlier, and of course it has the legendary G lens build. Based on the reviews that I've seen of this lens, some people are turned off by the f4 aperture, but for my style of shooting, f4 would be perfectly fine. I think a bigger con for me, beyond the price obviously, would be the size. I haven't seen this lens in real life, but I imagine it would be much bigger than the primes that we're talking about and the Tamron 20 to 40mm. So that's it. That concludes our real world review of the Sony 28mm f2.0 from sunny Italy. If you stuck around to the end of the video, mahalo, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to drop a like. If you have any questions about the Sony A7C2, Sony 28mm f2.0, or even traveling through Italy, please let me know in the comments below. I'd be happy to answer your questions. If you like this style of travel photography, please make sure to watch my first travel video linked in the end card. Finally, please consider subscribing for future content. Mahalo.